This is Colleen Marshall. NBC4 has confirmed the death of Ohio Senator and former astronaut John Glenn. Glenn, a native of New Concord, was an Ohio legend and American hero who dedicated his life to public service.
This is Mercury Control.
An astronaut, a senator, a decorated fighter pilot, an icon. Who could have known on a hot July day in 1921 in the tiny town of New Concord, Ohio, that a future American hero had been born? John Glenn witnessed history, and as the first American to orbit the Earth, he made it. But he started his life as a small-town Midwestern boy, and his beloved wife Annie really was at his side for all of it. Their parents were best friends, and they met in a playpen. He said there was never a time that he did not love her. And years later, when World War II delayed their wedding, he told her he was just stepping out for a pack of gum.
Oh, yeah, you know, I don't know how that popped into my mind, but when I was leaving, and it was a pretty sad time, of course, I told Annie that, look, don't worry about it, I'm just going down to get a pack of gum and I'll be back shortly. Every time I had to leave to do something then after that, whether it was in the Korean War or later on or in the astronaut program, it sort of got to be a little ritual. It sounds rather funny, but or peculiar.
Did you ever really get her a pack of gum?
Oh yes, yes. And I think to this day she carries a little gum wrapper in her wallet.
Glenn went willingly into battle, enlisting within hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor. For the greatest generation, there was no hesitation about the call to service.
No, there wasn't, and I think if you look back on it now, the last war that the United States had, where the people of this country were really united. I mean, like 98, 99% of the people wanted to do what we were doing and were willing to support it.
John Glenn flew 59 combat missions in World War II and 67 in the Korean War. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross on 6 separate occasions. After the wars, he became a fearless test pilot, setting the supersonic transcontinental record.
3 hours, 23 minutes, 8.4 seconds.
And then came the space program.
Early in life, there was no such word as astronaut. We didn't know there was such a word.
And few could picture the strapping 6'3" John Glenn folding himself into a tiny compartment inside a 9-foot-long capsule.
Godspeed, John Glenn. 2.
It was very important for the country at that time. And we look back on it, I think people forget what the impetus was for much of the astronaut program back in those days. We were in the depths of the Cold War with the Soviets at that time. And the Soviets were claiming technical superiority and research superiority to the United States.
Roger, the clock is operating. We're underway.
Neither Glenn nor NASA knew the true dangers of orbital flight. In fact, there was an eye chart inside the capsule because doctors believed with sustained weightlessness, he could go blind.
You knew what the dangers were, but the advantages of going were like going on a combat mission. You're representing your country, and if there were some dangers, well, you accepted that. People often ask, were you afraid? Not afraid to the point where you let it interfere with what you were doing.
Glenn and America's 6 other space pioneers set about the job of launching the world's leading space program.
I thought that Tom Wolfe's book, The Right Stuff, hit a lot of points. And there was a thread that ran through that of some of the things that we were doing back then as test pilots and astronauts that rang true. It was very good. But when Hollywood got hold of that, they sort of took Hollywood license with a lot of things, and the first 7 of us we didn't care for that movie at all.
Years after his famous orbit around the world, Glenn learned that President Kennedy told NASA to not send him back into space. Kennedy didn't want to risk the life of such an American hero. But Glenn got his second flight at the age of 77 on the shuttle, when the first American to orbit the Earth became the oldest man ever in space.
Liftoff of Discovery with a crew of 6 astronaut heroes and 1 American legend.
a legend who also served 4 terms as a United States Senator.
I'd been through 2 wars when I got to the Senate, and I thought nothing could be more horrible than contemplating a nuclear war. And so I was going to join forces with whoever was working on nuclear non-proliferation.
John Glenn was a best friend to Bobby Kennedy, and few people knew it was Glenn who sat on the edge of each Kennedy child's bed to tell them their father was dead.
One of the hardest things I ever did.
In May of 2012, President Obama awarded John Glenn the nation's Medal of Freedom for his lifetime of service to his country. But Glenn still had work to do.
You know, I'll leave legacies up to somebody else. I may be over 90, but that doesn't mean I've given up, and I think I invented another word the other day. I say instead of legacy, I like to think of it as a livacy. And I plan to be around a while. I haven't given up yet, and I think you keep going however you, not by what your calendar tells you, but by the way you feel. And that's sort of the way we've tried to run our lives.
As you just heard, we come to you with breaking news this afternoon. NBC4 confirming the death of Ohio Senator and former astronaut John Glenn. He has died at the age of 95. A native of New Concord, he was an Ohio legend, an American hero who dedicated his life to public service. His resume was extensive. It was so impressive. One of the stories we like the most here is that if you knew that he completed those 3 laps around the planet during his ride back to Earth back in 1962, and if you can imagine or remember back then, it was a bumpy one. Listen to the quote he said then. He said that during re-entry, quote, there were flaming chunks of the retro pack burning off and coming back by the window, he told NBC then. Absolutely unbelievable. He was impressive. He was beloved. Obviously, our airport here just named in his honor. He entered the space program as a participant in the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics for G-force testing. He was smart, he was beloved, he was respected. It was in January 1964 he finally resigned from NASA's astronaut program. We know he entered the Ohio Democratic primary not soon after. At 77 years old, he became the oldest person ever to venture into space. Now, when NASA puts out a call for pilots to participate in its programs, Glenn volunteered without hesitation. In 1959, NASA selected him as one of the first 7 astronauts in the U.S. space program. His father, Claire Glenn, his father, John Glenn Sr., was actually a plumber. On February 20th, 1962, atop of an Atlas rocket, he made history there. And we want to go to a soundbite now. When Glenn was awarded the Medal of Freedom by President Barack Obama, take a listen.
Stand by to start. ETI on my mark. Roger. 3, 2, 1, mark. You are go. Range operation. Go. Mercury capsule. Go. All pre-start power lights are correct. The ready light is on. T-minus 18 seconds and counting engine start. Godspeed, John Glenn. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Roger, the clock is operating. We're underway.
You're loud and clear.
Roger, we're programming and roll okay. A little bumpy along about here.
2, 1, mark.
Roger, backup clock is started.
And we want to clarify that was one of the many trips you just heard of John Glenn going into space. We talked about how he stepped out of the NASA program, but he wasn't gone for long. With 2 months left in his final term in the Senate, this was back in 1998, he went back up, becoming, as we mentioned, the oldest person to fly in space as a member of the crew of the Space Shuttle Discovery. He has spoken so much with the media over the years. He sat down with NBC4 for a wide-ranging interview, and one of the things he talked about most was how he wanted to be remembered. We asked him that question. He said that he wanted his legacy to be for so many things. And he said that, oh, we actually have that soundbite now. Take a listen.
What do you want the John Glenn legacy to be?
You know, I'll leave legacies up to somebody else. I may be over 90, but that doesn't mean I've given up, and I think I invented another word the other day. I say instead of legacy, I like to think of it as a livacy. And I plan to be around a while. I haven't given up yet, and I think you keep going however not by what your calendar tells you, but by the way you feel. And that's sort of the way we've tried to run our lives.
He was such a humble man. He also was in Right Stuff, and we want to show you a segment from that show. Take a look.
Decorated World War II fighter pilot, decorated Korean War fighter pilot, record-breaking test pilot. The first American astronaut to orbit the Earth.
The senator from Ohio is recognized.
United States Senator, the oldest American astronaut to fly into space. Recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Any one of those titles would be a point of pride. But John Glenn holds all of them. This small-town Central Ohio boy who fell in love with his childhood sweetheart grew up to witness and make history, proving to the world John Glenn has the right stuff. World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. stands in tribute to the 16 million men and women who served in the armed forces during World War II. 400,000 of them died in the war. It's considered the defining event of the 20th century. Those who served are known as the greatest generation. But even among a generation of heroes who preserved democracy and ensured freedom, there are those who stand apart. Those like John Glenn.
This World War II memorial holds significance for John Glenn, who's of course a decorated war pilot. He says back in 1941, he and Annie were then engaged. She was a music major at Muskingum College, and he was in his car on the way to her organ recital when he heard a radio report about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Before the end of the day, a decision was made to delay their wedding. He was going to become a fighter pilot. It was the beginning of his life of service to his country.
That changed our life and our direction because we talked that night that evening into the night to decide, and I made a decision, and she did too, that I would go ahead and go into the military and enter military flight training, which I did.
That generation instantly banded together. They say that term, band of brothers. But there wasn't any hesitation, this call to service at that time, was there?
No, there wasn't, and I think if you look back on it now, the last war that the United States had, where the people of this country were really united. I mean, like 98, 99% of the people wanted to do what we were doing and were willing to support it. World War II was about the last war. But that was one where you could foresee the United States as no longer being the United States if the other side won on that one.
There was so much at stake.
So much, and so that's one of the things in our historic site, my old home in New Concord. That's one of the things that we stress in that is we show the ration stamps out of World War II, where you could only buy so many pounds of meat a month, and gas rationing, you're only allowed to buy a certain amount of gasoline. It was a whole different way of life, and the people of this country were absolutely united in what we were trying to do.
Now, I've heard that when you would go off to war, you would tell Annie about a pack of gum. Is that a true story?
Oh, yeah, you know, I don't know how that popped into my mind, but when I was leaving, and it was a pretty sad time, of course, I told Annie that, look, don't worry about it, I'm just going down and get a pack of gum and I'll be back shortly. Every time I had to leave to do something then after that, whether it was in the Korean War or later on or in the astronaut program, it sort of got to be a little ritual. It sounds rather funny, but or peculiar.
Did you ever really get her a pack of gum?
Oh yes, yes. And I think to this day she carries a little gum wrapper in her wallet.
You have an odd situation, not just in your professional and your career life, but how many people know their spouse from when you were infants, from when you were babies?
Practically none, I guess. I haven't run into anybody for a long, long time, if ever, who's grew up quite the way we did. Our parents were good friends and lived not far apart and visited back and forth all the time. We had picnics together and they spent a lot of time together. So Annie and I never knew a time we didn't know each other. And so that's rather unusual these days. You ask somebody, where did you meet your husband or so-and-so? And they have a story, well, it was in this school or when I was in college or something or other. But Annie and I have never known a time we didn't know each other. A little unusual.
Glenn says Annie patiently waited as he served 59 combat missions in World War II. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross on 6 separate occasions.
Well, when the Korean War came along, did you ever hesitate to commit again to go into another war zone?
No, not at all. In fact, I volunteered. I was the other people who had trained as I had been out earlier in the war, and they hadn't sent me yet, and I kept writing. I was on the staff at Quantico, Virginia, and I wrote letters repeatedly to request assignment. I thought my training was something that wasn't being used where I was, and Korean War was on, and the other people I had trained with all had been there, and so I remember the colonel calling me in one day and telling me that no more letters, that when the Marine Corps got ready to send me, they would send me, and they did. A couple months later they did.
How many combat missions did you fly, do you know?
I had 59 in World War II and then had 67, I think it was, in Korea.
Were you ever shot down?
No, I never shot down. I've had airplane was shot up number of times by anti-aircraft fire. I was hit 5 times in World War II, most of them just single holes. And you know, those are just rifle fire things, and that's important, but it's not, you don't worry about those too much. But in Korea I was hit 7 times, and 3 of those were explosive shells, and those were ones that could have shot the airplane down, but the airplane kept flying, so I stayed with it.
I mean, I can't imagine when you're a fighter pilot that you go into it being afraid. I don't know how you could go into that without having every confidence that you were going to, you know, to come out unscathed.
You just put your finger a lot on what I think being a successful fighter pilot is. You don't doubt your own capabilities. You've trained, you've trained, you've trained. You have a confidence level that to most people would probably be ridiculous. But if you don't have that kind of confidence level, you're not going to do the kind of flying that you should do in combat.
But were you a hot dog pilot?
No, I don't think so. I was a, if by hot dog you mean did I do ridiculous flying things, no. I was very proud of my flying ability, and still am as far as that goes. But you didn't do hot dog things to where you're just showing off. You do the things that you have to do in combat to do the job you're sent there to do. If you don't have that kind of confidence, you should get in a different line of work. I'd recommend that.
Up next, John Glenn finds an unexpected new line of work.
Early in life, there was no such word as astronaut. We didn't know there was such a word.
And you heard a lot about John Glenn's beloved wife, Annie, and their love story. Did you know that they had never gone out on a date with anyone else? As you heard, they knew each other since they were just babies. It's really remarkable. And Annie was impressive too. She was an accomplished organist, and she even got offered a scholarship to Juilliard. So she too was extremely talented. Again, he married his high school sweetheart back in 1943, and you heard how fondly he spoke of her. Well, Glenn was also singled out for the Medal of Freedom because of his lifetime of service to his country. You heard all about his time in the war, 59 war missions, a life that mirrors the nation's modern day history, from his days as a Marine fighter pilot to his historic trip in a space capsule to his time as Ohio statesman on the floor of the U.S. Senate, his scientific journey on the shuttles, his leadership at the Ohio State University. He runs out of room on his resume.
John Glenn's example has moved us all to look to new horizons with drive and optimism.
Glenn's experience and skill made him a logical candidate for the astronaut corps, being formed during 1958 after his time in fighter planes throughout World War II. It seemed like a natural next step. He entered the space program as a participant in the National Advisory Committee, again on the Aeronautics G-Force tests, as they were called. When NASA put out a call for pilots to participate in this program, he volunteered without hesitation, just like he did for all those war missions. In 1959, NASA selected him as one of the first 7 astronauts in the U.S. space program. And as you know, he was the oldest person in space at 77. Now, on February 20th, 1962, atop of an Atlas rocket, he rode into space and he piloted the Friendship 7 spacecraft. That went around the globe 3 times, becoming the first American to ever orbit the Earth. Glenn's ride into space, a great technical accomplishment, held even greater significance for our country. Having lagged behind the Soviet Union in the space race, Americans saw this as a political as well as a scientific milestone. Across the country, they lauded Glenn as a hero who had conquered the bounds of Earth and given new wings to the American spirit.
This is Friendship 7. Can see clear back a big cloud pattern way back across toward the Cape. Beautiful sight.
Again, astronaut, war hero, lawmaker, pretty remarkable. And now we want to take you back to segment 2 of The Right Stuff and more on John Glenn's life.
The F-8U was one of the very first supersonic airplanes. John Glenn was part of the test pilot team for the F-8U when he proposed a transcontinental flight that would require 3 mid-air fuel changes. He set the supersonic transcontinental record.
It was a good thing. I'd like to repeat that one today. That was a project that was a lot of fun.
How fast did you go from New York to California?
Well, the other direction, California to New York.
Oh, it was California to New York.
3 hours, 23 minutes, 8.4 seconds.
How do you remember that?
It was easy.
It also helped set the stage for another famous flight.
Godspeed, John Glenn. 2.
It is barely 9 feet long. At its widest point, it's only 6 feet 3 inches, and it has got a tiny, tiny compartment where John Glenn made history. This is Mercury's Friendship 7. He orbited the Earth 3 times in this small capsule. He became the first American on February 20th, 1962, to orbit the planet. President Obama said when he gave Glenn the Presidential Medal of Freedom that it was the time that America stood still. In fact, for the first 30 minutes of that flight, the Chicago Police Department didn't get a single phone call. And President Kennedy famously interrupted a meeting with Congress because he wanted to listen to and watch John Glenn.
Roger, the clock is operating. We're underway.
When did you first hear about the space program? How was that first introduced to you?
It was when I was at Patuxent River and just at the end of my test pilot days there, when I was about to be reassigned, we started hearing about some of the studies being done down at Langley about orbital flight and a little more detail on it. And I went down there and was part of some of their studies down there, doing some computer studies.
Is that when you first heard the word astronaut? I mean, when did that become part of the
I don't know
vernacular?
when it was. Annie, I remember sort of a little humorous thing. Annie, when she first heard astronaut and knew what it was, she thought that they ought to take out the second A. Now you have to think about that. Spell out astronaut, and that leaves it astronut. If you take out the second A.
Did she think you were crazy to be part of that program?
No, well, it was brand new enough and different enough that she was not too enamored of the program to begin with, but she came around as I did to think it was very important for the country at that time. And we look back on it, I think people forget what the impetus was for much of the astronaut program back in those days. We were in the depths of the Cold War with the Soviets at that time. And the Soviets were claiming technical superiority and research superiority to the United States. And to prove it, they said, we're sending people into space, they're orbiting, and your launches are still blowing up on the launch pad. And they were using that as a selling point to take thousands of kids from third world countries into the Soviet Union, give them their education, send them back home again. And so it was the early days of the space program were driven to of the human aspect of it, were driven largely by the fact of the Cold War. And so that was one of the reasons why we were so anxious to get going and have some success. And then they just as we were getting ready to send Al Shepard up on a suborbital flight, just up and down, not around the Earth, was when the Soviets then orbited Yuri Gagarin around the Earth. We thought Al was going to be the first human being to ever go into space. Well, Yuri Gagarin not only went into space before, but orbited, where our plans were to do a suborbital flight. And then Gus Grissom made the next suborbital flight. And that was up and down too, the flights are about 20 minutes long. Then my flight came up after that, and I think that's one reason there was so much attention to it at the time. Also, I think an important factor here was the fact that President Eisenhower at that time had decided that our program, and I think to his everlasting credit, our program was going to be open and open to everybody all over the world and the world's press. And that what we learned out of going into space, we would share with other nations. And we carried forward on that. And that contrasted with the Soviets, who their program was extremely secret. We got very, very little information.
You know, when you look at the capsule at the Air and Space Museum there in Washington, how tiny that space is. You know, you're a tall man. You had to have some apprehension. No one is that calm.
If you were not aware of the dangers involved, you were too numb to be there, would be my view of that. But it was like going on a combat mission. You know, you go on a combat mission, you're going to get shot at on almost every mission, by anti-aircraft fire at least. You knew what the dangers were, but the advantages of going were like going on a combat mission. You're representing your country, and if there were some dangers, well, you accepted that. People often ask, were you afraid? Not afraid to the point where you let it interfere with what you were doing.
Neither Glenn nor NASA knew the true dangers of orbital flight. In fact, there was an eye chart inside the capsule because some doctors believed with sustained weightlessness, he could go blind.
Some of the ophthalmologists thought that your eyes in zero G, when you're weightless, your eyes might change shape because they no longer need to be supported by the structure under the eye. And so you're up there for several hours, your eyes gradually change shape. Would you be able to even see the instrument panel so you could make an emergency re-entry if you had to?
When you look at the book and you look at the movie, does that pretty fairly reflect what life was like for the seven of you back then?
Another answer, no. No, he fictionalized is right. That's a good word for it. I thought that Tom Wolfe's book, The Right Stuff, hit a lot of points. And there was a thread that ran through that of some of the things that we were doing back then as test pilots and astronauts that rang true. It was very good. But when Hollywood got hold of that, they sort of took Hollywood license with a lot of things, and the first seven of us we didn't care for that movie at all.
After his famous orbit around the world, Glenn was baffled about why NASA wouldn't put him back on the flight schedule. Years later, he learned President Kennedy didn't want to risk the life of such an iconic space hero.
There was a biography of Kennedy that came out, and in the biography, they said that Kennedy had told NASA that he would rather I would not be used for a while on another flight. Now, this was after he had been killed that I found out about this. I never had a chance to discuss it with him at that time, or had I known about this at the time, I probably would have wanted to try and go talk to him.
Crew now on their way to Launch Pad 39B.
But Glenn finally did get that second flight. NASA had charted temporary changes to the human body in space that mimic aging. Glenn proposed an experiment to chart changes in someone who had already aged. He was 77 when he blasted back into space on the shuttle.
And liftoff of Discovery with a crew of 6 astronaut heroes and 1 American legend.
If we can learn from this experience in space more about what causes the human body to react in certain ways, whether you're getting old on Earth or temporarily have this effect in space, that can be very, very valuable sometime.
Just ahead, 4 terms as Ohio Senator, lessons John Glenn learned in Washington, his thoughts on politics today, and his surprising tie to one of the nation's tragedies.
If you are just joining us, John Glenn has passed away at the age of 95. The astronaut, the former U.S. Senator and veteran, died at the OSU Wexner Medical Center today, again, nearing 100 years old. NBC4's Ted Hart joins us now. They're live with what we know. Hello, Ted.
Katie, John Glenn was brought here to the hospital, we know, last week. He was not doing well. And we know that he had prior heart surgery. That was a couple of years ago, but he'd recovered from that. But folks who had seen him recently could tell that he was declining in declining health. He came here last week, and then this afternoon we got the news that he had passed. Of course, he's a big deal here at Ohio State University, as not to mention the entire country. But here at OSU, you know, there's the John Glenn School of Public Affairs. He dedicated a lot of his energy and time to Ohio State University in recent years. Spent the last 10 years here living in Columbus with his wife. A true space pioneer, a public servant, just an extraordinary human being. Katie?
Ted, live on OSU's campus at the Wexner Medical Center. Thank you so much. And yes, such an impressive man, a man that will be missed by so many, a man that helped make history here in America for us all. I want to take you now to the third segment of The Right Stuff and more on his amazing life.
John Glenn can lay claim to a lot of firsts, and not just in the space program. He was the first and only Ohioan to be elected to 4 terms in the United States Senate. He served 24 years here.
What is your proudest accomplishment in the Senate?
In the Senate? Oh, there were a number of areas. You can't say just one, I guess. I'd been through 2 wars when I got to the Senate, and I thought nothing could be more horrible than contemplating a nuclear war. And so I was going to join forces with whoever was working on nuclear non-proliferation, trying to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons around the world. And I got there and there wasn't much going on in that, so I think it's fair to say I became a leader in that area. And we passed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act of 1978, and that's still the law of the land to this day, and some of the sanctions that can be put in and so on. And it had some effect at that time. I'm proud of our efforts on that.
John Glenn also points with pride to his chairmanship of the Governmental Affairs Committee, where he worked for government efficiency. He says that's not an oxymoron. He pushed through a requirement for independent inspectors general in 18 federal departments and agencies.
So for the first time, we gave the IGs independence to do some of the things that you see coming up today when the IGs are, and I'm proud of that. And it's a, the IGs are very proud of their independence, and that's because of what we did with that.
Glenn says he's troubled by something he sees today on Capitol Hill, a divisiveness, partisanship so deep that he says it stands in the way of progress. Glenn says during his own time on Capitol Hill, he tried to foster a collegial atmosphere, reaching across the aisle, working with people from both parties to get the job done. And in his earliest days in politics, he worked hard for a man who was one of his closest and dearest friends, Robert Kennedy.
Well, Annie and I were with him in the hotel out there in California the night he was shot.
The Glenns rushed to Ethel's side at the hospital. 5 of the 11 Kennedy children were campaigning with them in California, and it fell to John and Annie to tell them about the shooting and take them home to Hickory Hill, Virginia.
Bobby was still alive the next day, and Ethel decided she'd rather have the kids back at Hickory Hill in Virginia, and asked if Annie and I would take the 5 kids that we knew and take them back to Hickory Hill. And so we did, and that second night was the night that Bobby died. And so there was one of the neighbor people, Susie Markham, who knew the kids well too. And that next morning, Susie and I had to sit on the edge of the bed and tell each kid their dad was dead.
Is it even possible to say what that was like, to have to tell those children?
One of the hardest things I ever did.
Glenn says he won't allow himself to wonder what if, but he knows the nation would be different if John and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King had escaped assassin bullets. John Glenn left the Senate the same year he went back into space at the age of 77. He will be 91 later this month. But he did not retire. Today, he helps lead the John Glenn School of Public Affairs at The Ohio State University.
People tend to stagnate maybe if they don't have some purpose when they wake up in the morning. I think everyone should have something that they're looking forward to doing.
Don't go away. We're going to have John Glenn's surprising take on his own legacy and the honor of a lifetime.
And Glenn's legacy is also one of perseverance. He never let a setback stop him. Did you know that he ran for the Senate back in 1970 and he failed at that point? He eventually won in 1974 and served 4 consecutive terms. He was also frequently mentioned as a possible vice presidential running mate, but was never selected. He had such an extensive, as we've talked about all afternoon, war history, law history, and of course, as Colleen just mentioned, going back into space at 77. We want to take you now back to the 4th segment of The Right Stuff and hear more about his life.
John Glenn was back in Washington in May to receive the nation's highest civilian honor. He was one of the recipients of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. At his side, his 2 children, 2 grandchildren, and his beloved Annie.
As we look at how his life mirrored the history of this country in nearly the last century, I think his real story is a love story. Would you agree with that? Because you've been at his side.
Well, I've known him since I was 2 years old. I think it's going to last.
Do you think?
We've been married 69 years now.
Oh, wow. Wow. Yeah, I think you might make it. I think you 2 kids might just make it.
Glenn was humbled by this honor of a lifetime.
John Glenn's example has moved us all to look to new horizons with drive and optimism.
Glenn was singled out for the Medal of Freedom because of his lifetime of service to his country, a life that mirrors the nation's modern-day history. From his days as a Marine fighter pilot, to his historic trip in a space capsule, to his time as Ohio's statesman on the floor of the United States Senate, his scientific journey on the shuttle, his leadership at The Ohio State University.
What do you want the John Glenn legacy to be?
You know, I'll leave legacies up to somebody else. I may be over 90, but that doesn't mean I've given up, and I think I invented another word the other day. I say instead of legacy, I like to think of it as a livacy. And I plan to be around a while. I haven't given up yet, and I think you keep going however you, not by what your calendar tells you, but by the way you feel. And that's sort of the way we've tried to run our lives.
And that's the right stuff. Godspeed, John Glenn.
A legacy. I love that. Thank you so much for joining us for our special coverage of the life and the legacy of the beloved John Glenn. We take you now to the Ellen Show in progress, and join us back here at 5 for team coverage of more about his remarkable life.